The year is 1864. The humid air of Georgia is thick with the scent of pine resin and burning wood. For 60 miles wide, the horizon is glowing orange. It is not a wildfire. It is an army. There is a strange silence beneath the roar of the flames. The silence of a world holding its breath, waiting to see what new monster has been born. This is not the sound of battle, but of an idea, taking root in the scorched earth. We are watching the death of an old way of war. For generations, conflict had been a formal affair, a gentleman's game played on open fields. Think of the Napoleonic Wars, with their bright uniforms and ordered lines of infantry marching toward each other in a grim, predictable ballet. Armies met, fought, and one side retreated. The contest was between soldiers, a violent but contained ritual that left the civilian world largely untouched. It was war as a duel, governed by a code of conduct, a sense of chivalry that, however thin, separated the combatant from the citizen. But here, in the American South, a new, terrifying philosophy is unfolding. The architect of this change is General William Tecumseh Sherman, a man who understood that a nation's heart is not found on the battlefield but in its homes, its farms, and its spirit. He decided to wage war not just against an army, but against a population's mind. His goal was not merely to defeat soldiers, but to break the will of an entire people, to make the very idea of resistance unthinkable. Sherman's march was a masterclass in psychological warfare, a campaign of systematic destruction aimed at the infrastructure that fed and supplied the Confederate war machine. But his troops did more than just tear up railroad tracks. They turned destruction into a form of grotesque, symbolic art. They would pry the heavy iron rails from their wooden sleepers, stack them over immense bonfires until they glowed a cherry red, and then with brute force and grim creativity twist them around the trunks of massive oak and pine trees. These mangled sculptures of iron were nicknamed Sherman-S neckties, or Sherman-S boaties. They were not just vandalism, they were a message. Each twisted rail was a declaration that this was not a temporary disruption, this was an erasure. The iron could never be straightened, the lines could never be rebuilt with the same materials. It was a permanent scar on the landscape, a monument to the futility of continued struggle. These neckties were a new kind of weapon, one that attacked not the body, but the hope of a nation. Imagine a sepia-toned daguerreotype, its edges softened by time. It shows a city street in Atlanta, or perhaps Savannah. But the buildings are just hollowed-out shells, their windows like vacant eyes staring into a gray sky. Chimneys stand alone like tombstones in a field of rubble. Another image, a map, carefully drawn, with a thick, dark line gouged across the state of Georgia, a wound stretching from the ashes of Atlanta to the sea. The line represents 60,000 men, a river of blue uniforms flooding the countryside, consuming everything in its path. And then, the most haunting visual of all, a slow cinematic pan through a quiet sun-dappled forest. The light filters through the leaves, catching on something unnatural. It's a Sherman's necktie, the iron rail wrapped tightly around a tree. Its metal rusted to a deep earthy brown. It looks almost organic, like a vine that grew too strong. But it is a relic of calculated chaos, a piece of industrial sin left to rust in the cathedral of the woods. It is a sculpture of total war. It is easy to condemn this strategy as pure barbarism, a descent into a kind of warfare without honor. The destruction of civilian property, the burning of farms, the deliberate dismantling of a society's ability to sustain itself. It feels like a moral line being crossed. And yet, there is a terrible, paradoxical truth to be found in the smoke and ruin of Sherman's march to the sea. This brutal campaign was, in a grim calculus of human life, arguably an act of mercy. The Civil War had been a meat grinder for 3 long years, a relentless slaughter that had already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives with no end in sight. By attacking the South's economic and psychological foundations, Sherman was not just defeating an army, he was ending a war. He made the cost of continuing the fight so impossibly high, so devastatingly personal for the entire population, that surrender became the only logical option. He was shortening the conflict, and in doing so, he likely saved tens, if not hundreds, of thousands of lives that would have been lost in the protracted battles of a war fought by the old rules. He made the conflict too terrible to endure, and so it ended. In the space of a single autumn, the world changed. The old agreements, the unspoken rules that governed how men killed each other, were burned away with the Georgia harvests. War was no longer a duel between armies, a contest of courage on a designated field. It had become a machine, an impersonal, all-consuming force that devoured everything in its path: cities, farms, railroads, and the very spirit of its enemy. It was no longer about winning a battle, it was about erasing the capacity to fight at all. The age of chivalry was over, consumed by the flames of progress. The age of total war, a war of economies, of psychology, of entire societies pitted against one another, had begun, leaving only a profound and lasting silence in its wake.